Peter Pan and Wendy by James Matthew Barrie. Chapter 5. The Island Come True. Feeling that Peter was on his way back, the Neverland had again woke into life. We ought to use the pluperfect and say wakened, but woke is better and was always used by Peter. In his absence things are usually quiet on the island. The fairies take an hour longer in the morning, and the beasts attest to their young. The redskins feed heavily for 6 days and nights, and when pirates and lost boys meet, they merely bite their thumbs at each other. But with the coming of Peter, who hates the lethargy, they are under way again. If you put your ear to the ground now, you would hear the whole island seething with life. On this evening, the chief forces of the island were disposed as follows. The lost boys were out looking for Peter. The pirates were out looking for the lost boys. The redskins were out looking for the pirates. And the beasts were out looking for the redskins. They were going round and round the island, but they did not meet because they were all going at the same rate. All wanted blood except the boys, who liked it as a rule, but tonight were out to greet their captain. The boys on the island vary, of course, in numbers, according as they get killed and so on, and when they seem to be growing up, which is against the rules, Peter thins them out. But at this time there were 6 of them, counting the twins as 2. Let us pretend to lie here among the sugar-cane and watch them as they steal by in single file, each with his hand on his dagger. They are forbidden by Peter to look in the least like him, and they wear the skins of bears slain by themselves, in which they are so round and furry that when they fall they roll. They have, therefore, become very sure-footed. The first to pass is Tootles, not the least brave, but the most fortunate of all the gallant band. He had been in fewer adventures than any of them, because the big things constantly happened just when he had stepped round the corner. All would be quiet. He would take the opportunity to go off to gather a few sticks for firewood, and then when he returned the others would be sweeping up the blood. This ill luck had given a gentle melancholy to his countenance, but instead of souring his nature had sweetened it, so that he was quite the humblest of the boys. Poor kind Tootles, there is danger in the air for you tonight. Take care lest an adventure is offered now to you, which, if accepted, will plunge you in deepest woe. Tootles, the fairy Tink, who is bent on mischief this night, is looking for a tool, and she thinks that you are the most easily tricked of the boys. 'Ware Tinker Bell. Would that he could hear us, but we are not really on the island, as he passes by, biting his knuckles. Next comes Nibs, the gay and debonair, followed by Slightly, who cuts whistles out of the trees and dances ecstatically to his own tunes. Slightly is the most conceited of the boys. He thinks he remembers the day before he was lost, with their manners and customs, and this has given his nose an offensive tilt. Curly is 4th. He is a pickle, and so often he has had to deliver up his person, when Peter said sternly, "Stand forth the one who did this thing," that now, at the command, he stands forth automatically whether he has done it or not. Last come the twins, who cannot be described because we should be sure to be describing the wrong one. Peter never quite knew what twins were, and his band were not allowed to know anything he did not know. So these 2 were always vague about themselves, and did their best to give satisfaction by keeping close together in an apologetic sort of way. The boys vanish in the gloom, and after a pause, but not a long pause, for things go briskly on the island, come the pirates on their track. We hear them before they are seen, and it is always the same dreadful song. "Avast belay, yo-ho, heave to, a-pirating we go, and if we're parted by a shot, we're sure to meet below." A more villainous-looking lot never hung in a row on execution dock. Here, a little in advance, ever and again with his head to the ground listening, his great arms bare, pieces of 8 in his ears as ornaments, is a handsome Italian Chico, who cut his name in letters of blood on the back of the governor of the prison of Gao. That gigantic black behind him has had many names since he dropped the one with which dusky mothers still terrify their children on the banks of the Guadjo. Here is Bill Jukes, every inch of him tattooed, the same Bill Jukes who got 6 dozen on the walrus from Flint before he could drop the bag of moidores, and Cookson, said to be Black Murphy's brother, but this was never proved, and Gentleman Starkey, once an usher in a public school and still dainty in his way of killing, and Skylights, Morgan's Skylights, and the Irish bosun Smee, an oddly genial man who stabbed, so to speak, without offense, and was the only nonconformist in Hook's crew, and Noodler, whose hands were fixed on backwards, and Robert Mullins, and Alf Mason, and many another ruffian long known and feared on the Spanish Main. In the midst of them, the blackest and largest in that setting, reclined James Hook, or as he wrote himself, Jas Hook, of whom it is said he was the only man that the sea cook feared. He lay at his ease in a rough chariot drawn and propelled by his men, and instead of a right hand he had an iron hook, with which ever and anon he encouraged them to increase their pace. As dogs, this terrible man treated and addressed them, and as dogs they obeyed him. In person he was cadaverous and blackavised, and his hair was dressed in long curls, which at a little distance looked to be black candles, and gave a singularly threatening expression to his handsome countenance. His eyes were of the blue of the forget-me-not, and of a profound melancholy, save when he was plunging his hook into you, at which time 2 red spots appeared in them and lit up horribly. In this manner, something of a grand seigneur still clung to him, so that he even ripped you up with an air, and I have been told that he was a raconteur of repute. He was never more sinister than when he was most polite, which is probably the truest test of breeding, and the elegance of his diction, even when he was swearing, no less distinction of his demeanor, showed him one of a different caste from his crew. A man of indomitable courage, it was said that the only thing he shied at was the sight of his own blood, which was thicker and of an unusual color. In dress he somewhat aped the attire associated with the name of Charles II, having heard it said in some earlier period of his career that he bore a strange resemblance to the ill-fated Stuarts. And in his mouth he had a holder of his own contrivance which enabled him to smoke 2 cigars at once, but undoubtedly the grimmest part of him was his iron claw. Let us now kill a pirate to show Hook's method. Skylights will do. As they pass, Skylights lurches clumsily against him, ruffling his lace collar, and Hook shoots forth. There is a tearing sound, and one screech, then the body is kicked aside and the pirates pass on. He has not even taken the cigars from his mouth. Such is the terrible man against whom Peter Pan is pitted. Which will win? On the trail of the pirates, stealing noiselessly down the warpath, which is not visible to inexperienced eyes, come the redskins, every one of them with his eyes peeled. They carry tomahawks and knives, and their naked bodies gleam with paint and oil. Stung around them are scalps of boys as well as pirates, for these are the Pickaninny tribe, and not to be confused with the softer-hearted Delawares of the Hurons. In the van on all fours is the great big little panther, a brave of so many scalps that in his present position they somewhat impede his progress. Bringing up the rear, the place of the greatest danger, comes Tiger Lily, proudly erect, a princess in her own right. She is the most beautiful of dusky Dianas, and the belle of the Pickaninnies, coquettish, cold, and amorous by turns. There is not a brave who would not have the wayward thing to wife, but she stabs off the altar with a hatchet. Observe how they pass over fallen twigs without making the slightest noise. The only sound to be heard is their somewhat heavy breathing. The fact is that they are all a little fat just now after the heavy gorging, but in time they will work this off. For a moment, however, it constitutes their chief danger. The redskins disappear as they have come like shadows, and soon their place is taken by the beasts, a great and motley procession. Lions, tigers, bears, and innumerable smaller savage things that flee from them, for every kind of beast, and, more particularly, all the man-eaters, live cheek by jowl on the favored island. Their tongues are hanging out. They are hungry tonight. When they have passed, comes the last figure of all, a giant crocodile. We shall see for whom she is presently looking. The crocodile passes, but soon the boys appear again, and the procession must continue indefinitely until one of the parties stops or changes its pace. Then quickly they will be on top of each other. All are keeping a sharp lookout in front, but none suspects that the danger may be creeping up from behind. This shows how real the island was. The first to fall out of the moving circle was the boys. They flung themselves down on the sward, close to the underground home. I do wish Peter would come back, every one of them said nervously, though in height and still more in breadth they were all larger than their captain. I am the only one who is not afraid of the pirates, Slightly said, in a tone that prevented his being a general favorite, but perhaps some distant sound disturbed him, for he added hastily, "But I wish he would come back and tell us whether he has heard anything more about Cinderella." They talked of Cinderella, and Tootles was confident that his mother must have been very like her. It was only in Peter's absence that they could speak of mothers, the subject being forbidden from him as silly. All I remember about my mother, Nibs told them, is that she often said to my father, "Oh, how I wish I had a checkbook of my own. I don't know what a checkbook is, but I should just love to give my mother one." While they talked, they heard a distant sound. You or I, not being wild things of the woods, would have heard nothing, but they heard it, and it was the grim song. Yo ho, the pirate life, the flag of skulls and bones, a merry hour, a hump and rope, and hey for Davy Jones. At once the lost boys, but where are they? They are no longer there. Rabbits could not have disappeared more quickly. I will tell you where they are. With the exception of Nibs, who has darted away to reconnoiter, they are already in their home under the ground, a very delightful residence, of which we shall see a good deal presently. And how have they reached it? For there's no entrance to be seen, not so much as a large stone, which if rolled away would disclose the mouth of a cave. Look closely, however, and you may note that there are here 7 large trees, each with a hole in its hollow trunk as large as a boy. These are the 7 entrances to the home under the ground, for which Hook has been searching in vain all these many moons. Will he find it tonight? As the pirates advanced, the quick eye of Starkey sighted Nibs disappearing through the wood, and at once his pistol flashed out, but an iron claw gripped his shoulder. "Captain, let me go," he cried, writhing. Now for the first time we hear the voice of Hook. It was a black voice. "Put back that pistol first," he said threateningly. "It was one of those boys you hate. I could have shot him dead." "Aye, and the sound would have brought Tiger Lily's redskins upon us. Do you want to lose your scalp?" "Shall I after him, Captain?" asked pathetic Smee, "and tickle him with Johnny Corkscrew?" Smee had pleasant names for everything, and his cutlass was Johnny Corkscrew, because he wiggled it in the wound. One could mention many lovable traits in Smee. For instance, after killing, it was his spectacles he wiped instead of his weapon. "Johnny's a silent fellow," he reminded Hook. "Not now, Smee," Hook said darkly. "He is only one, and I want to mischief all the 7. Scatter and look for them." The pirates disappeared among the trees, and in a moment their captain and Smee were alone. Hook heaved a heavy sigh, and I know not why it was. Perhaps it was the soft beauty of the evening, but there came over him a desire to confide in his faithful bosun the story of his life. He spoke long and earnestly, but what it was all about Smee, who was rather stupid, did not know in the least. Anon he caught the word Peter. "Most of all," Hook was saying passionately, "I want their captain, Peter Pan. Was he cut off my arm?" He brandished his hook threateningly. "I've waited long to shake his hand with this. Oh, I'll tear him." "And yet," said Smee, "I have often heard you say that Hook was worth a score of hands, for combing the hair and other homely uses." "Aye," the captain answered. "If I was a mother, I would pray to have my children born with this instead of that." And he cast a look of pride upon his iron hand, and one of scorn upon the other. Then again he frowned. "Peter flung my arm," he said, wincing, "to a crocodile that happened to be passing by." "I have often," said Smee, "noticed your strange dread of crocodiles." "Not of crocodiles," Smee corrected him, "but of that one crocodile." He lowered his voice. "It liked my arm so much, Smee, that it has followed me ever since, from sea to sea, and from land to land, licking its lips for the rest of me." "In a way," said Smee, "it's sort of a compliment." "I want no such compliments," Hook barked petulantly. "I want Peter Pan, who first gave the brute its taste for me." He sat down on a large mushroom, and now there was a quiver in his voice. "Smee," he said huskily, "that crocodile would have me before this. But by a lucky chance it swallowed a clock which goes tick-tick inside, and so before it can reach me I hear the tick and bolt." He laughed, but in a hollow way. "Some day," said Smee, "the clock will run down, and then he'll get you." Hook wetted his dry lips. "Aye," he said, "that's the fear that haunts me." Since sitting down he felt curiously warm. "Smee," he said, "this seat is hot." He jumped up. "Odds bobs! Hammer and tongs, I'm burning!" They examined the mushroom, which was of a size and solidity unknown on the mainland. They tried to pull it up, and it came away at once in their hands, for it had no root. Stranger still, smoke began at once to ascend. The pirates looked at each other. "A chimney!" they both exclaimed. They had indeed discovered the chimney of the home under the ground. It was the custom of the boys to stop it with a mushroom when enemies were in the neighborhood. Not only smoke came out of it, there came also children's voices. for so safe did the boys feel in their hiding place that they were gaily chattering. The pirates listened grimly, and then replaced the mushroom. They looked around them and noted the holes in the 7 trees. "Did you hear them say Peter Pan's from home?" Smee whispered, fidgeting with Johnny Corkscrew. Hook nodded. He stood for a long time lost in thought, and at last a curdled smile lit up his swarthy face. Smee had been waiting for it. "Unrip your plan, Captain," he cried eagerly. "To return to the ship," Hook replied slowly through his teeth, "and cook a large, rich cake of a jolly thickness, with green sugar on it. There can be but one room below, for there is but one chimney. The silly moles did not the sense to see that they did not need a door-piece. That shows they have no mother. We will leave the cake on the shore of the Mermaid's Lagoon. These boys are always swimming about there, playing with the mermaids. They will find the cake and they will gobble it up, because having no mother, they don't know how dangerous 'tis to eat rich damp cake." He burst into laughter. Not hollow laughter now, but honest laughter. "Aha, they will die." Smee had listened with growing admiration. "It's the wickedest, prettiest policy ever I heard of," he cried, and in their exultation they danced and sang. "A vast belay when I appear, by fear they're overtook. Naught's left upon your bones when you have shaken claws with Hook." They began the verse, but they never finished it, for another sound broke in and stilled them. There was at first such a tiny sound that a leaf might have fallen on it and smothered it, but as it came nearer it was more distinct. Tick, 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 tick. Hook stood shuddering, 1 foot in the air. "The crocodile!" he gasped, and bounded away, followed by his bo'sun. It was indeed the crocodile. It had passed the redskins, who were now on the trail of the other pirates. It oozed on after Hook. Once more the boys emerged into the open, but the dangers of the night were not yet over, for presently Nibs rushed breathless into the midst, pursued by a pack of wolves. The tongues of the pursuers were still hanging out. The baying of them was still horrible. "Save me! Save me!" cried Nibs, falling on the ground. "But what can we do? What can we do?" It was a high compliment to Peter that in that dire moment their thoughts turned to him. "What would Peter do?" they cried simultaneously. Almost in the same breath they cried, "Peter would look at them through his legs." And then, "Let us do what Peter would do." It is quite the most successful way of defying wolves, and as one boy they bent and looked through their legs. The next moment was a long one, but victory came quickly, for as the boys advanced upon them in their terrible attitude, the wolves dropped their tails and fled. Now Nibs rose from the ground, and the others thought that his staring eyes still saw the wolves. But it was not wolves he saw. "I have seen a wonderfuller thing," he cried as they gathered round him eagerly. "A great white bird. It is flying this way." "What kind of bird do you think?" "I don't know," Nibs said, awestruck. "But it looks so weary, and as it flies it moans, 'Poor Wendy, poor Wendy.'" "I remember," said Slightly instantly. "There are birds called Wendies." "See, it comes," cried Curly, pointing to Wendy in the heavens. Wendy was now almost overhead, and they could hear her plaintive cry, but more distinct came the shrill voice of Tinker Bell. The jealous fairy had now cast off all disguise of friendship, and was darting at her victim from every direction, pinching savagely each time she touched. "Hello, Tink!" cried the wondering boys. Tink's reply rang out, "Peter wants you to shoot the Wendy." It was not in their nature to question when Peter ordered. "Let us do what Peter wishes," cried the simple boys. "Quick, bows and arrows!" All but Tootles popped down the trees. He had a bow and arrow with him, and Tink noted it and rubbed her little hands. "Quick, Tootles, quick!" she screamed. "Peter will be so pleased." Tootles excitedly fitted the arrow to his bow. "Out of the way, Tink," he shouted, and then he fired, and Wendy fluttered to the ground with an arrow in her breast. Chapter 6. The Little House. Foolish Tootles was standing like a conqueror over Wendy's body when the other boys sprang, armed, from their trees. "You're too late," he cried proudly. "I have shot the Wendy. Peter will be so pleased with me." Overhead, Tinker Bell shouted, "Silly ass," and darted into hiding. The others did not hear her. They had crowded round Wendy, and as they looked a terrible silence fell upon the wood. If Wendy's heart had been beating, they all would have heard it. Slightly was the first to speak. "This is no bird," he said in a scared voice. "I think this must be a lady." "A lady?" said Tootles, and fell a-trembling. "And we have killed her," Nibs said hoarsely. They all whipped off their caps. "Now I see," Curly said. "Peter was bringing her to us." He threw himself sorrowfully to the ground. "A lady to take care of us at last," said one of the twins, "and you have killed her." They were sorry for him, but sorrier for themselves, and when he took a step nearer them, they turned from him. Tootle's face was very white, and there was a dignity about him now that had never been there before. "I did it," he said, reflecting. "When ladies used to come to me in dreams, I said, 'Pretty mother, pretty mother.' But when at last she really came, I shot her." He moved slowly away. "Don't go," they called in pity. "I must," he answered, shaking. "I am so afraid of Peter." It was at this tragic moment that they heard a sound which made the heart of every one of them rise to his mouth. They heard Peter crow. "Peter," they cried, for it was always thus that he signaled his return. "Hide her," they whispered, and gathered hastily around Wendy, but Tootles stood aloof. Again came that ringing crow, and Peter dropped in front of them. "Greetings, boys," he cried, and mechanically they saluted, and then again was silence. He frowned. "I'm back," he said hotly. "Why do you not cheer?" They opened their mouths, but the cheers would not come. He overlooked it in his haste to tell the glorious tidings. "Great news, boys," he cried. "I have brought at last a mother for you all." Still no sound, except a little thud from Tootles as he dropped on his knees. "Have you not seen her?" asked Peter, becoming troubled. "She flew this way." "Ah me," one voice said, and another said, "Oh, mournful day." Tootles rose. "Peter," he said quietly, "I will show her to you." And when the others would still have hidden her, he said, "Back, twins, let Peter see." So they all stood back and let him see, and after he had looked for a little time, he did not know what to do next. "She is dead," he said uncomfortably. "Perhaps she is frightened at being dead." He thought of hopping off in a comic sort of way till he was out of sight of her, and then never going near the spot any more. They would have all been glad to follow if he had done this. But there was the arrow. He took it from her heart and faced his band. "Whose arrow?" he demanded sternly. "Mine, Peter," said Tootles on his knees. "Oh, dastard hand," Peter said, and he raised the arrow and used it as a dagger. Tootles did not flinch. He bared his breast. "Strike, Peter," he said firmly. "Strike true." Twice did Peter raise the arrow, and twice did his hand fall. "I cannot strike," he said with awe. "There is something stays my hand." All look at him in wonder, save Nibs, who fortunately looked at Wendy. "It is she," he cried. "The Wendy lady. See, her arm." Wonderful to relate, Wendy had raised her arm. Nibs bent over her and listened reverently. "I think," she said, "poor Tootles," he whispered. "She lives," Peter said briefly. Slightly cried instantly, "The Wendy lady lives!" Then Peter knelt beside her and found his button. You remember she had put it on a chain that she wore round her neck? "See," he said, "the arrow stuck against this. It is the kiss I gave her. It has saved her life." "I remember kisses," Slightly interposed quickly. "Let me see it. Aye, that's a kiss." Peter did not hear him. He was begging Wendy to get better quickly, so that he could show her the mermaids. Of course she could not answer yet, being still in a frightful faint, but from overhead came a wailing note. "Listen to Tink," said Curly. "She is crying because the Wendy lives." Then they had to tell Peter of Tink's crime, and almost never had they ever seen him look so stern. "Listen, Tinker Bell," he cried. "I am your friend no more. Be gone from me forever." She flew onto his shoulder and pleaded, but he brushed her off. Not until Wendy again raised her arm did he relent sufficiently to say, "Well, not forever, but for a whole week." Do you think Tinker Bell was grateful to Wendy for raising her arm? Oh dear, no. Never wanted to pinch her so much. Fairies indeed are strange, and Peter, who understood them best, often cuffed them. But what to do with Wendy in her present delicate state of health? "Let us carry her down into the house," Curly suggested. "Aye," said Slightly, "this is what one does with ladies." "No, no," Peter said. "You must not touch her. It would not be sufficiently respectful." "That," said Slightly, "is what I was thinking." "But if she lies there," Tootles said, "she will die." "Aye, she will die," Slightly admitted, "but there is no way out." "Yes, there is," cried Peter. "Let us build a little house around her." They were all delighted. "Quick," he ordered them. "Bring me each of you the best of what we have. Gut our house. Be sharp." In a moment they were busy as tailors the night before a wedding. They scurried this way and that, down for bedding, up for firewood, and while they were at it, who should appear but John and Michael? As they dragged along the ground, they fell asleep standing, stopped, woke up, moved another step, and slept again. "John, John," Michael would cry, "wake up. Where is Nana, John, and Mother?" And then John would rub his eyes and mutter, "It is true, we did fly." You may be sure they were very relieved to find Peter. "Hello, Peter," they said. "Hello," replied Peter amicably, though he had quite forgotten them. He was very busy at the moment, measuring Wendy with his feet to see how large a house she would need. Of course he meant to leave room for chairs and a table. John and Michael watched him. "Is Wendy asleep?" they asked. "Yes." "John," Michael proposed, "let us wake her and get her to make supper for us." But as she said it, some of the other boys rushed on carrying branches for the building of the house. "Look at them," he cried. "Curly," said Peter in his most captainy voice, "see that these boys help in the building of the house." "Aye, aye, sir." "Build a house?" exclaimed John. "For the Wendy," said Curly. "For Wendy?" John said aghast. "Why, she's only a girl." "That," explained Curly, "is why we are her servants." "You? Wendy's servants?" "Yes," said Peter, "and you also. Away with them." The astounded brothers were dragged away to hack and hew and carry. "Chairs and a fender first," Peter ordered, "and then we shall build a house around them." "Aye," said Slightly, "that is how a house is built. It all comes back to me." Peter thought of everything. "Slightly," he cried, "fetch a doctor." "Aye, aye," said Slightly at once, and disappeared, scratching his head. But he knew Peter must be obeyed, and he returned in a moment, wearing John's hat and looking solemn. "Please, sir," said Peter, going to him, "are you a doctor?" The difference between him and the other boys at such a time was that they knew it was make-believe, while to him make-believe and true were exactly the same thing. This sometimes troubled them, as when they had to make believe that they had to have their dinners. If they broke down in their make-believe, he rapped them on the knuckles. "Yes, my little man," Slightly anxiously replied, who had chapped knuckles. "Please, sir," Peter explained, "a lady lies very ill." She was lying at their feet, but Slightly had the sense not to see her. "Tut, tut, tut," he said, "where does she lie?" "In yonder glade." "I will put a glass thing in her mouth," said Slightly, and he made believe to do it, while Peter waited. It was an anxious moment when the glass thing was withdrawn. "How is she?" inquired Peter. "Tut, tut, tut," said Slightly, "this has cured her." "I am glad," Peter cried. "I will call again in the evening," Slightly said. "Give her beef tea out of a cup with a spout on it." But after he had returned the hat to John, he blew big breaths, which was his habit on escaping from a difficulty. In the meantime, the wood had been alive with the sound of axes. Almost everything needed for a cozy dwelling already lay at Wendy's feet. "If only we knew," said one, "the kind of house she likes best." "Peter," shouted another, "she is moving in her sleep." "Her mouth opens," cried a third, looking respectfully into it. "Oh, lovely." "Perhaps she is going to sing in her sleep," said Peter. "Wendy, sing the kind of house you would like to have." Immediately, without opening her eyes, Wendy began to sing. "I wish I had a pretty house, the littlest ever seen, with funny little red walls and a roof of mossy green." They gurgled with joy at this, for by the greatest good luck the branches they had brought were sticky with red sap, and all the ground was carpeted in moss. As they rattled up the little house, they broke into song themselves. "We've built the little walls and roof and made a lovely door. So tell us, Mother Wendy, what are you wanting more?" To this she answered greedily, "Oh, really next, I think I'll have gay windows all about, with roses peeping in, you know, and babies peeping out." With a blow of their fists they made windows, and large yellow leaves were the blinds, but roses. "Roses!" cried Peter sternly. Quickly they made believe to grow the loveliest roses up the walls. Babies! To prevent Peter ordering babies, they hurried into song again. "We've made the roses peeping out, the babes are at the door. We cannot make ourselves, you know, 'cause we've been made before." Peter, seeing this to be a good idea, at once pretended that it was his own. The house was quite beautiful, and no doubt Wendy was very cozy within, though, of course, they could no longer see her. Peter strode up and down, ordering finishing touches. Nothing escaped his eagle eyes. Just when it seemed absolutely finished, "There's no knocker on the door," he said. They were very ashamed, but Toodles gave the sole of his shoe, and it made an excellent knocker. Absolutely finished now, they thought. Not a bit of it. "There's no chimney," Peter said. "We must have a chimney." "It certainly does need a chimney," said John importantly. This gave Peter an idea. He snatched the hat off John's head, knocked out the bottom, and put the hat on the roof. The little house was so pleased to have such a capital chimney that, as if to say thank you, smoke immediately began to come out of the hat. Now really and truly it was finished. Nothing remained to do but to knock. "All look your best," Peter warned them. "First impressions are awfully important." He was glad no one asked him what first impressions were. They were too busy looking their best. He knocked politely, and now the wood was still as the children. Not a sound was to be heard except from Tinker Bell, who was watching from a branch and openly sneering. What the boys were wondering was, would anyone answer the knock? If a lady, what would she be like? The door opened, and a lady came out. It was Wendy. They all whipped off their hats. She looked properly surprised, and this was just how they had hoped she would look. "Where am I?" she said. Of course Slightly was the first to get a word in. "Wendy, lady," he said rapidly, "for you we built this house." "Oh, say you're pleased," cried Nibs. "Lovely, darling house," Wendy said, and they were the very words they had hoped she would say. "And we are your children," cried the twins. Then they all went on their knees, holding out their arms, and cried, "Oh, Wendy, lady, be our mother." "Ought I?" Wendy said, all shining. "Of course it's frightfully fascinating, but you see I am only a little girl. I have no real experience." "That doesn't matter," said Peter, as if he was the only person present who knew all about it, though he was really the one who knew the least. "What we need is just a nice motherly person." "Oh dear," Wendy said. "You see, I feel that is exactly what I am." It is, they all cried. "We saw it at once." "Very well," she said. "I will do my best. Come inside at once, you naughty children. I am sure your feet are damp. And before I put you to bed, I have just time to finish the story of Cinderella." In they went. I don't know how there was room for them, but you can squeeze very tight in Neverland. And that was the first of many joyous evenings they had with Wendy. By and by she tucked them up in the bed in the home under the trees, and she herself slept that night in the little house, and Peter kept watch outside with a drawn sword, for the pirates could be heard carousing far away and the wolves were on the prowl. The little house looked so cozy and safe in the darkness, with a bright light showing through its blinds, and the chimneys smoking beautifully, and Peter standing on guard. After a time he fell asleep, and some unsteady fairies had to climb over him on their way home from an orgy. Any of the other boys obstructing the fairy path at night, they would have been mischieved, but they just tweaked Peter's nose and passed on. Chapter 7. The Home Under the Ground. One of the first things Peter did next day was to measure Wendy and John and Michael for hollow trees. Hook, you remember, had sneered at the boys for thinking they needed a tree apiece, but this was ignorance, for unless your tree fitted you, it was difficult to go up and down, and no two of the boys were quite the same size. Once you fitted, you drew in your breath at the top, and down you went at exactly the right speed, while to ascend you drew in and let out alternatively, so you wriggled up. Of course, when you have mastered the action you are able to do these things without thinking of them, and nothing can be more graceful. But if you simply must fit, and Peter measures you for the tree as carefully as for a suit of clothes, the only difference being that the clothes are made to fit you, while you have to be made to fit the tree. Usually it is done quite easily, as by your wearing too many garments or too few. But if you are bumpy in awkward places, or the only available tree is an odd shape, Peter does some things to you, and after that you fit. Once you fit, great care must be taken to go on fitting, as this, as Wendy was to discover to her delight, keeps a whole family in perfect condition. Wendy and Michael fitted their trees at the first try, but John had to be altered a little. After a few days' practice they can go up and down as gaily as buckets in a well. And how ardently they grew to love their home under the ground, especially Wendy. It consisted of one large room, as all houses should do, with a floor in which you could dig if you wanted to go fishing, and in this floor grew stout mushrooms of a charming color, which were used as stools. A never-tree tried to grow in the center of the room, but every morning they sawed through the trunk, level with the floor. By tea-time it was always 2 feet high, and then they put a door on top of it, the whole thus becoming a table. As soon as they cleared away, they sawed the trunk again, and thus was more room to play. There was an enormous fireplace, which was in almost any part of the room where you cared to light it, and across this Wendy stretched strings made of fiber from which she suspended her washing. The bed was tilted against the wall by day and let down at 6:30, when it nearly filled half the room, and all the boys slept in it, except Michael, lying like sad sardines in a tin. If there was a strict rule against turning round until one gave the signal, when all turned at once. Michael should have used it also, but Wendy would have a baby when he was the littlest, and you know what women are. and the short and long of it was that he was hung up in a basket. It was rough and simple, and not unlike what baby bears would have made of an underground house in the same circumstances. But there was one recess in the wall, no larger than a bird cage, which was the private apartment of Tinker Bell. It could be shut off from the rest of the house by tiny curtains, which Tink, who was most fastidious, always kept drawn when dressing and undressing. No woman, however large, could have had a more exquisite boudoir and bedchamber combined. The couch, as she always called it, was a genuine Queen Mab with club legs, as she varied the bedspreads according to what fruit blossom was in season. Her mirror was a Puss in Boots, of which there are now only 3, unchipped, known to fairy dealers. The washstand was pie crust and reversible, the chest of drawers an authentic Charming the 6th, and the carpet and rugs the best, the early period of Marjorie and Robin. There was a chandelier from Tiddlywinks for the look of the thing, and of course she lit the residence herself. Tink was very contemptuous of the rest of the house, as indeed was perhaps inevitable, and her chamber, though beautiful, looked rather conceited, having the appearance of a nose permanently turned up. I suppose it was all especially entrancing to Wendy, because those rampagious boys of hers gave her so much to do. Really, there was whole weeks when, except perhaps with a stocking in the evening, she was never above ground. The cooking, I can tell you, kept her nose to the pot, and even if there was nothing in it, even if there was no pot, she had to keep watching that it came a boil just the same. You never exactly knew whether there would be a real meal or just a make-believe. It all depended upon Peter's whim. He could eat, really eat, if it was part of a game, and he could not stodge just to feel stodgy, which was what most children like better than anything else. The best thing being to talk about it. Make-believe was so real to him that during a meal you could see him getting rounder. Of course it was trying, but you simply had to follow his lead, and if you could prove to him that you were getting loose for your tree, he'd let you stodge. Wendy's favorite time for sewing and darning was after they had all gone to bed. Then, as she expressed it, she had a breathing time for herself, and she occupied it making new things for them, and putting double pieces on the knees, for they were all most frightfully hard on their knees. When she set down a basketful of their stockings, every heel had a hole in it. She would fling up her arms and exclaim, "Oh dear, I am sure I sometimes think spinsters are to be envied." Her face beamed when she exclaimed this. You wonder about her pet wolf. Well, it very soon discovered that she had come to the island, and it found her out, and they just ran into each other's arms. After that it followed her about everywhere. As time wore on, did she think about the beloved parents she had left behind? This is a difficult question, because it is quite impossible to say how time does wear on in Neverland, where it is calculated by moons and suns, and there are ever so many more of them than on the mainland. But I am afraid that Wendy did not really worry about her mother and father. She was absolutely confident that they would always keep the window open for her to fly back, and this gave her complete ease of mind. What did disturb her at times was that John remembered his parents vaguely only, and as people he had once known, while Michael was quite willing to believe that she was really his mother. These things scared her a little, and nobly anxious to do her duty, she tried to fix the old life in their minds by setting them examination papers on it, as like as possible to the ones she used to do at school. The other boys thought this awfully interesting, and insisted on joining, and they made slates for themselves, and sat round the table, writing and thinking hard about the questions she had written on another slate and passed around. They were the most ordinary questions. What was the color of our mother's eyes? Which was taller, father or mother? Was mother blonde or brunette? Answer all 3 questions if possible. Write an essay of not less than 40 words on How I Spent My Last Holidays, or The Characters of Mother and Father Compared. Only one of these to be attempted. Or 1. Describe mother's laugh, 2. Describe father's laugh, 3. Describe mother's party dress, 4. Describe the kennel and its inmate. They were just everyday questions like these, and when you could not answer them you were told to make a cross, and it was really dreadful what a number of crosses even John made. Of course, the only boy who ever replied to this question was Slightly, and no one could have been more hopeful of coming out first, but his answers were perfectly ridiculous, and he really came out last, a melancholy thing. Peter did not compete. For one thing, he despised all mothers except Wendy, and for another, he was the only boy on the island who could neither write nor spell, not the smallest word. He was above all that sort of thing. By the way, the questions were all written in the past tense. What was the color of mother's eyes, and so on. Wendy, you see, had been forgetting too. Adventures, of course, as we will see, were of daily occurrence, but about this time Peter invented, with Wendy's help, a new game that fascinated him enormously, until he suddenly had no more interest in it, which, as you have been told, was what always happened with his games. It consisted in pretending not to have adventures, in doing the sort of thing John and Michael had been doing all their lives, sitting on stools, flinging balls in the air, pushing each other, going out for walks and coming back without having killed so much as a grizzly. To see Peter doing nothing on a stool was a great sight. He could not help looking solemn at such times. To sit still seemed to him such a comic thing to do. He boasted that he had gone walking for the good of his health. For several suns these were the most novel of all adventures to him, and John and Michael had to pretend to be delighted also. Otherwise he would have treated them severely. He often went out alone, and when he came back you were never absolutely certain whether he had had an adventure or not. He might have forgotten it so completely that he had said nothing about it, and then when you went out you found the body, and on the other hand he might have had a great deal to say about it, and yet you could not find the body. Sometimes he came home with his head bandaged, and then Wendy cooed over him and bathed it in lukewarm water, while he told a dazzling tale, but she was never quite sure, you know. There were, however, many adventures which she knew to be true because she was in them herself, and there were still more that were at least partly true, for these other boys were in them and said they were wholly true. To describe them all would require a book as large as an English-Latin, Latin-English dictionary, and the most we can do is to give one as a specimen of an average hour on the island. The difficulty is which one to choose. Should we take the brush with the Redskins at Slightly Gulch? It was a sanguinary affair, and especially interesting as showing one of Peter's peculiarities, which was that in the middle of a fight he would suddenly change sides. At the Gulch, when victory was still in the balance, sometimes leaning this way and sometimes that, he called out, "I'm Redskin today, what are you, Toodles?" And Toodles answered, "Redskin, what are you, Nibs?" And Nibs said, "Redskin, what are you, Twin?" And so on, and they were all Redskins, and of course this would have ended the fight, had not the real Redskins, fascinated by Peter's methods, agreed to be lost boys for that once, and so they went all at it again, more fiercely than ever. The extraordinary upshot of this adventure was, but we have not decided yet that this is the adventure we are to narrate. Perhaps a better one would be the night attack by the Redskins on the house of the underground, when several of them stuck in the hollow trees and had to be pulled out like corks. Or we might tell how Peter saved Tiger Lily's life in the Mermaid's Lagoon, and so made her his ally. Or we could tell of the cake the pirates cooked so that the boys might eat it and perish, and how they placed it in one cunning spot after another, but always Wendy snatched it from the hands of her children, so that in time it lost its succulence, and became as hard as a stone, and was used as a missile, and Hook fell over it in the dark. Or perhaps we tell of the birds that were Peter's friends, particularly of the Never Bird that built a tree overhanging the lagoon, and how the nest fell into the water, and still the bird sat on her eggs, and Peter gave orders that she was not to be disturbed. That is a pretty story, and at the end shows how grateful a bird can be, but if we tell it, we must also tell the whole adventure of the lagoon, which would of course be telling two adventures rather than just one. A shorter adventure, and quite as exciting, was Tinker Bell's attempt, with the help of some of the street fairies, to have a sleeping Wendy conveyed on a great floating leaf to the mainland. Unfortunately, the leaf gave way and Wendy woke, thinking it was bath time, and swam back. Or again, we might choose Peter's defiance of the lions, when he drew a circle around him on the ground with an arrow and dared them to cross it, and though he waited for hours, with the other boys and Wendy looking on breathlessly from the trees, not one of them dared accept his challenge. Which of these adventures shall we choose? The best way will be to toss for it. I have tossed, and the lagoon has won. This almost makes one wish that the Gulch or the cake or the Tink's leaf had won. Of course I could do it again. Make it the best out of 3. Perhaps fairest to stick to lagoon. Chapter 8. The Mermaid's Lagoon. If you shut your eyes and are a lucky one, you may see at times a shapeless pool of lovely pale colors suspended in the darkness. Then if you squeeze your eyes tighter, the pool begins to take shape, and the colors become so vivid that with the other squeeze they must go on fire. But just before they go on fire you see the lagoon. This is the nearest you ever get to the mainland. Just one heavenly moment. If there could be 2 moments you might see the surf and hear the mermaids singing. The children often spent long summer days on this lagoon, swimming or floating most of the time, playing the mermaid games in the water and so forth. You must not think from this that mermaids were on friendly terms with them. On the contrary, it was among Wendy's lasting regrets that all the time she was on the island she never had a civil word from one of them. When she stole softly to the edge of the lagoon, she might see them by the score, especially on Marooner's Rock, where they loved to bask, combing out their hair in a lazy way that quite irritated her. Or she might even swim, on tiptoe as it were, to within a yard of them, but then they saw her and dived, probably splashing her with their tails, not by accident, but intentionally. They treated all the boys in the same way, except of course Peter, who chatted with them on Marooner's Rock by the hour, and sat on their tails when they got cheeky. He gave Wendy one of their combs. The most haunting time at which to see them is at the turn of the moon, when they utter strange wailing cries. But the lagoon is dangerous for mortals then, and until the evening of which we have now to tell, Wendy had never seen the lagoon by moonlight, less from fear, for of course Peter would have accompanied her, than because she had strict rules about every one being in bed by 7. She was often at the lagoon, however, on sunny days after rain, when the mermaids come up in extraordinary numbers to play with their bubbles. The bubbles of many colors made in rainbow water they treat as balls, hitting them gaily from one to another with their tails, and trying to keep them in the rainbow till they burst. The goals are at the end of the rainbow, and the keepers are only allowed to use their hands. Sometimes a dozen of these games will be going on in the lagoon at a time, and it is quite a pretty sight. But the moment the children tried to join in, they had to play by themselves, for the mermaids immediately disappeared. Nevertheless, we have proof that they secretly watched the interlopers, and were not above taking an idea from them, for John introduced a new way of hitting the bubble, with the head instead of the hand, and the mermaids adopted it. This is the one mark that John left on the Neverland. It must also have been rather pretty to see the children resting on a rock for half an hour after their midday meal. Wendy insisted on doing this, and it had been a real rest even though the meal was make-believe. So they lay there in the sun, and their bodies glistened in it, while they sat beside them and looked important. It was one such day when they were all on Mariner's Rock. The rock was not much larger than their great bed, and of course they all knew how not to take up much room, and they were dozing, or at least lying, with their eyes shut, and pinching occasionally when they thought Wendy was not looking. She was very busy stitching. While she stitched, a change came to the lagoon. Little shivers ran over it, and the sun went away, and shadows stole up across the water, turning it cold. Wendy could no longer see to thread her needle, and when she looked up, the lagoon, that had always hitherto been such a laughing place, seemed formidable and unfriendly. It was not, she knew, that night had come, but something as dark as night had come. No, worse than that. It had not come, but it had sent the shiver through the sea to say that it was coming. What was it? There crowded upon her all the stories that had been told in Marooner's Rock, so called because evil captains put sailors on it and leave them there to drown. They drown when the tide rises, for then it is submerged. Of course, she should have roused the children at once, not merely because of the unknown that was stalking toward them, but because it was no longer good for them to sleep on the rock, grown chilly. But she was a young mother and did not know this. She thought you simply ought to stick to your rule about half an hour after the midday meal. So, though fear was upon her, she longed to hear male voices. She would not waken them. Even when she heard the sound of muffled oars, though her heart was in her mouth, she did not waken them. She stood over them and let them have their sleep out. Was it not brave of Wendy? It was well for those boys, then, that there was among them one who could sniff danger even in his sleep. Peter sprang erect, and wide awake at once as a dog, and with one warning cry he roused the others. He stood motionless, one hand to his ear. "Pirates!" he cried, and the others came closer. A strange smile was playing about his face, and Wendy saw it and shuddered. While that smile was on his face, no one dared address him. All they could do was to stand ready and obey. The orders came sharp and incisive. "Dive!" There was a gleam of legs, and instantly the lagoon seemed deserted. Mariner's Rock stood alone in the forbidding waters as if it were itself marooned. A boat drew nearer. It was the pirate dinghy, with 3 figures in her, Smee and Starkey, and the third a captive, no other than Tiger Lily. Her hands and ankles were tied, and she knew what was to be her fate. She was to be left on the rock to perish, an end to one of her race more terrible than death by fire or torture, for it is not written in the book of the tribe that there is no path through water to the happy hunting ground. Yet her face was impassive. She was the daughter of a chief. She must die as a chief's daughter. It is enough. They had caught her boarding the pirate ship with a knife in her mouth. No watch was kept on the ship. it being Hook's boast that the wind of his name guarded the ship for a mile around. Now her fate would help to guard it also. One more whale would go the round in that wind by night. In the gloom that they brought with them, 2 pirates did not see the rock till they crashed into it. "Luff, you lubber!" cried an Irish voice that was Smee's. "Here's a rock. Now then, what have we to do is to hoist the redskin onto it and leave her here to drown." It was the work of one brutal moment to land the beautiful girl on the rock. She was too proud to offer a vain resistance. Quite near the rock, but out of sight, 2 heads were bobbing up and down. Peter's and Wendy's. Wendy was crying, for it was the first tragedy she had seen. Peter had seen many tragedies, but he had forgotten them all. He was less sorry than Wendy for Tiger Lily. It was 2 against 1 that angered him, and he meant to save her. An easy way would have been to wait until the pirates had gone, but he was never one to choose an easy way. There was almost nothing he could not do, and he now imitated the voice of Hook. "Ahoy there, you lubbers!" he called. It was a marvelous imitation. "The captain," said the pirates, staring at each other in surprise. "He must be swimming out to us," Starkey said, when they had looked for him in vain. "We are putting the redskin on the rock," Smee called out. "Set her free," came the astonishing answer. "Free?" "Yes, cut her bonds and let her go." "But, Captain—" "At once, d'ye hear?" cried Peter, "or I'll plunge my hook in you." "This is queer," Smee gasped. "Better do what the captain orders," said Starkey nervously. "Aye, aye," Smee said, and he cut Tiger Lily's cords. At once, like an eel, she slid between Starkey's legs into the water. Of course, Wendy was very elated over Peter's cleverness, but she knew that he would also be elated, and very likely crow and thus betray himself. So at once her hand went out to cover his mouth, but it was stayed even in the act. For "Boat ahoy!" rang over the lagoon in Hook's voice, and this time it was not Peter who had spoken. Peter may have been about to crow, but his face puckered in a whistle of surprise instead. "Boat ahoy!" again came the voice. Now Wendy understood. The real Hook was also in the water. He was swimming to the boat, and as his men showed a light to guide him, he had soon reached them. In the light of the lantern, Wendy saw his hook grip the boat's side, and he saw an evil, swarthy face as he rose dripping from the water, and, quaking, she would have liked to swim away, but Peter would not budge. He was tingling with life and also top-heavy with conceit. "Am I not a wonder? Oh, I am a wonder," he whispered to her. And though she thought so also, she was really glad for the sake of his reputation that no one heard him except for herself. He signed her to listen. The 2 pirates were very curious to know what had brought the captain to him, but he sat with his head on his hook in a position of profound melancholy. "Captain, all is well?" they asked timidly, but he answered with a hollow moan. "He sighs," said Smee. "He sighs again," said Starkey. "And yet a 3rd time he sighs," said Smee. Then at last he spoke passionately. "The game's up," he cried. "The boys have found a mother." Affrighted though she was, Wendy swelled with pride. "Oh, evil day!" cried Starkey. "What's a mother?" asked the ignorant Smee. Wendy was so shocked that she exclaimed, "He doesn't know!" And always after this she felt that if she could have a pet pirate, Smee would be her one. Peter pulled her beneath the water, for Hook had started up crying. "What was that?" "I heard nothing," said Starkey, raising a lantern over the waters, and as the pirates looked they saw a strange sight. It was the nest I have told you of, floating on the lagoon. The Never-bird was sitting on it. "See," said Hook in answer to Smee's question, "that is a mother. What a lesson! The nest must have fallen into the water. But would the mother desert her eggs? No." There was a break in his voice, as if for a moment he recalled innocent days when... But he brushed away his weakness with his hook. Smee, much impressed, gazed at the bird as the nest was borne past, but the more suspicious Starkey said, "If she is a mother, perhaps she is hanging about here to help Peter." Hook winced. "Aye," he said, "that is the fear that haunts me." He was roused from his dejection by Smee's eager voice. "Captain," said Smee, "could we not kidnap these boys' mother and make her our mother?" "It is a princely scheme," cried Hook, and at once it took piratical shape in his great brain. "We will seize the children and carry them to the boat. The boys we will make walk the plank, and Wendy shall be our mother." Again Wendy forgot herself. "Never!" she cried and bobbed. What was that? But they could see nothing. They thought it must have been a leaf in the wind. "Do you agree, my bullies?" asked Hook. "There is my hand on it," they both said. "And there is my hook. Swear." They all swore. By this time they were on the rock, and suddenly Hook remembered Tiger Lily. "Where's the redskin?" he demanded abruptly. He had a playful humor at moments, and they thought this was one of the moments. "That is all right, Captain," Smee answered complacently. "We let her go." "Let her go?" cried Hook. "'Twas your own orders," the boatswain faltered. "You called over the water for us to let her go," said Starkey. "Brimstone and gall," thundered Hook. "What cozening is going on here?" His face had gone black with rage, but he saw that they believed their words, and he was startled. "Lads," he said, shaking a little, "I gave no such order." "It is passing queer," Smee said, and they had all fidgeted uncomfortably. Hook raised his voice, but there was a quiver in it. "Spirit that haunts this dark lagoon tonight," he cried, "dost hear me?" Of course Peter should have kept quiet, but of course he did not. He immediately answered in Hook's voice, "Odds, bobs, hammers, and tongues, I hear you." In that supreme moment, Hook did not blanch, even at the gills, but Smee and Starkey clung to each other in terror. "Who are you, stranger? Speak," Hook demanded. "I am James Hook," replied the voice, "captain of the Jolly Roger." "You are not, you are not," Hook cried hoarsely. "Brimstone and gall," the voice retorted. "Say that again and I'll cast anchor in you." Hook tried a more ingratiating manner. "If you are Hook," he said humbly, "come tell me who I am." "A codfish," replied the voice. "Only a codfish." "A codfish," Hook echoed blankly. It was then, but not until then, that his proud spirit broke. He saw his men draw back from him. "We have been captained all this time by a codfish," they muttered. "It is lowering to our pride." They were his dogs snapping at him, but, tragic figure though he had become, he scarcely needed them. Against such fearful evidence, it was not their belief in him that he needed, it was his own. He felt his ego slipping from him. "Don't desert me, bully," he whispered hoarsely to it. In his dark nature there was a touch of the feminine, as in all the great pirates, and it sometimes gave him intuitions. Suddenly he tried the guessing game. "Hook," he called, "have you another voice?" Now Peter could never resist a game, and he answered blithely in his own voice. "I have." "And another name?" "Aye, aye." "Vegetable?" asked Hook. "No." "Mineral?" "No." "Animal?" "Yes." "Man?" "No." This answer rang out scornfully. "Boy?" "Yes." "Ordinary boy?" "No." "Wonderful boy?" To Wendy's pain, the answer that rang out this time was yes. "Are you in England?" "No." "Are you here?" "Yes." Hook was completely puzzled. "You ask him some questions," he said to the others, wiping his damp brow. Smee reflected. "I can't think of a thing," he said regretfully. Can't guess, crowed Peter. "Do you give it up?" Of course, in his pride, he was carrying the game too far, and the miscreants saw their chance. "Yes, yes," they answered eagerly. "Well then," he cried, "I am Peter Pan." Pan! In a moment, Hook was himself again, and Smee and Starkey were his faithful henchmen. "Now we have him," Hook shouted. "Into the water, Smee. Starkey, mind the boat. Take him dead or alive." He leaped as he spoke, and simultaneously came the gay voice of Peter. "Are you ready, boys?" "Aye, aye," from various parts of the lagoon. "Then lam into the pirates." The fight was short and sharp. First to draw blood was John, who gallantly climbed into the boat and held Starkey. There was a fierce struggle in which the cutlass was torn from the pirate's grasp. He wriggled overboard and John leapt after him. The dinghy drifted away. Here and there a head bobbed up in the water, and there was a flash of steel followed by a cry or a whoop. In the confusion, some struck at their own side. The corkscrew of Smee got Tootles in the fourth rib, but he was himself pinked and turned by Curly. Farther from the rock, Starkey was pressing slightly, and the twins hard. Where all this time was Peter? He was seeking bigger game. The others were all brave boys, and they must not be blamed for backing from the pirate's captain. His iron claw made a circle of dead water around him, from which they fled like affrighted fishes. But there was one who did not fear him. There was one who prepared to enter that circle. Strangely, it was not in the water that they met. Hook rose to the rock to breathe, and at the same moment Peter scaled it on the opposite side. The rock was as slippery as a ball, and they had to crawl rather than to climb. Neither knew that the other was coming. Each feeling for a grip met the other's arm. In surprise, they raised their heads, their faces almost touching. So they met. Some of the greatest heroes have confessed that just before they fell to, they had a sinking. Had it been so with Peter at that moment, I would admit it. After all, he was the only man that the sea cook had feared. But Peter had no sinking. He had only one feeling, gladness, and he gnashed his pretty teeth with joy. Quick as thought, he snatched a knife from Hook's belt and was about to drive it home, when he saw that he was higher up on the rock than his foe. It would not have been fighting fair. He gave the pirate a hand and helped him up. It was then that Hook bit him. Not the pain of this, but the unfairness was what dazed Peter. It made him quite helpless. He could only stare, horrified. Every child is affected thus the first time he is treated unfairly. All he thinks he has a right to, when he comes to you, to be yours in fairness. After you have been unfair to him, he will love you again, but will never afterwards be quite the same boy. No one ever gets over the first unfairness, no one except Peter. He often met it, but he always forgot it. I suppose that was the real difference between him and all the rest. So when he met it now, it was like the first time, and he could just stare, helpless. Twice the iron hand clawed him. A few moments afterwards, the other boys saw Hook in the water, striking wildly for the ship. No elation on the pestilent face now, only white fear, for the crocodile was in dogged pursuit of him. On ordinary occasions the boys would have swum along cheering, and now they were uneasy, for they had lost both Peter and Wendy, and were scouring the lagoon for them, calling them by name. They found the dinghy and went home in it, shouting, "Peter, Wendy!" as they went, but no answers came save mocking laughter from the mermaids. They must be swimming back or flying, the boys concluded. They were not very anxious, for they had such faith in Peter. They chuckled, boy-like, because they would be late for bed, and it was all Mother Wendy's fault. When their voices died away, there came a cold silence over the lagoon, and then a feeble cry. "Help! Help!" Two small figures were beating against the rock. The girl had fainted and lay on the boy's arm. With a last effort, Peter pulled her up on the rock and then lay down beside her. Even as he also fainted, he saw that the water was rising. He knew that soon he would be drowned, but he could do no more. As they lie side by side, a mermaid caught Wendy by the feet and began pulling her softly into the water. Peter, feeling her slip from him, woke with a start and was just in time to draw her back, but he had to tell her the truth. "We are on the rock, Wendy," he said, "but it is growing smaller. Soon the water will be over it." She did not understand even now. "We must go," she said, almost brightly. "Yes," he answered faintly. "Shall we swim or fly, Peter?" he had to tell her. "Do you think you could swim or fly as far as the island, Wendy, without my help?" She had to admit that she was too tired. He moaned. "What is it?" she asked, anxious about him at once. "I can't tell you, Wendy. Hook wounded me. I can neither fly nor swim." "Do you mean we shall both be drowned? Look at how the water is rising." They put their hands over their eyes to shut out the sight. They thought they would soon be no more. As they sat thus, something brushed against Peter as light as a kiss, and stayed there, as if saying timidly, "Can I be of any use?" It was the tail of a kite, which Michael had made some days before. It had torn itself out of his hand and floated away. "Michael's kite," Peter said without interest, but next moment he had seized the tail and was pulling the kite toward him. "It lifted Michael off the ground," he cried. "Why should it not carry you?" "Both of us?" "It can't lift two." Michael and Curly tried. "Let us draw lots," Wendy said bravely. "And you a lady, never." Already he had tied the tail around her. She clung to him. She refused to go without him. But with a "Goodbye, Wendy," he pushed her from the rock, and in a few moments she was borne out of his sight. Peter was gone on the lagoon. The rock was very small now. Soon it would be submerged. Pale rays of light tiptoeing across the waters, and by there was to be heard a sound at once the most musical and the most melancholy in the world, the mermaids calling to the moon. Peter was not quite like other boys, but he was afraid at last. A tremor ran through him, like a shudder passing over the sea. But on the sea one shudder follows another till there are hundreds of them, and Peter felt just the one. Next moment he was standing erect on the rock again, with that smile on his face and a drum beating within him. It was saying, "To die will be an awfully big adventure."